There was a sound that used to open every street in Britain before the rest of the world woke up. The scrape of a stone against cold stone, a bucket set down on brick, a woman on her knees at 7 in the morning working the front step until it gleamed white, long before anyone in the house had eaten breakfast, long before the milkman had even finished his round. That sound is gone now. Nobody hears it anymore. And with that stone she would scrub the front step of the house until it turned white, or cream, or a deep reddish brown, depending on where in the country she lived. In Liverpool, it was cream. In Wigan, it was white. It did not matter which color. This was the working class mother of 1950, 1960, 1970. She was not resting. She was not waiting for the day to begin. She had already begun it, on her hands and knees, with a small block of scouring stone that most people today have never even seen. And here is the part nobody tells you. This was not just cleaning. This was survival in the eyes of the street. A woman whose step was not properly stoned was talked about, whispered about behind curtains, called lazy, called something far worse. The step was the first thing anyone saw when they walked past your house, and in a working-class terrace, everyone walked past your house. So she knelt there, rain or shine, in a housecoat and a headscarf, working the stone into the edge of the step until it formed a neat, clean line. And while she worked, so did the woman 2 doors down, and the one across the road, all of them out at the same time on a Saturday morning, all of them talking, all of them watching each other's steps out of the corner of their eye. This was not vanity. This was a code, and it was only the first task of a day that had not even properly started yet. Because behind her, inside that house, there was a fire grate waiting to be blacked before anyone touched it with bare hands, a wash day coming that would take the better part of a day on its own, and a family of 5 or 6 waiting to be fed, on a budget that had to stretch from Friday to Friday without a single penny going astray. She did all of it, every day, and she did it without anyone ever once suggesting that it might be too much. Before we move on, a quick note. If you've ever heard your grandmother or mother talk about the stone doorstep, the one treated with donkey stone, let us know in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to the channel, as every week we bring you more real stories like this one about life in Britain that no one else is telling. By the time that step was dry, she was already thinking about food, not for one meal, for the whole week. And this is where the second invisible skill of the working class mother comes in, one that has almost completely vanished from British life. She did not shop once a week with a trolley in a supermarket. There were no supermarkets, not really, not until well into the 1960s. And even then, most working class women did not trust them. Instead, she walked. Every single day, sometimes twice a day, she walked to a string of separate shops, each one run by someone she knew by name. The butcher, who might put a little extra mince in for her if the week had been hard. The baker, whose bread came out at a certain hour. The greengrocer, who knew which vegetables were about to turn and would quietly point her toward them cheaper before they spoiled. She carried it all home herself in a basket over one arm, or a pull-along trolley that rattled over the pavement, because very few working-class families owned a car. Historians who studied households from this period found something remarkable. These women managed entire family budgets down to the last coin, tracked what was owed, what was saved, and what could never be touched, all without a bank account of their own, and often without their name on anything at all. If the money ran short before the week was out, and it often did, she did not go to the bank. She went to the corner shop and asked for tick, a small book kept behind the counter, where the shopkeeper wrote down what she owed until payday came around again. This was not shameful in the way debt is treated today. It was simply how working-class streets survived. Trust between a mother and her local shopkeeper was as real as any contract, built up over years, over hundreds of small transactions, over favors quietly extended when a child was sick or a husband was between jobs. There was no app to check a balance, no card to tap, just memory, honesty, and a relationship that had to be protected. Because if it broke down, there was nowhere else to turn. That is a kind of financial pressure that barely exists in the same form today, village. And yet she carried it every single day, on top of everything else waiting for her at home. Monday was washing day. Not a suggestion. Not a chore that could be pushed to whenever suited her best. An institution, followed in almost every working-class street in Britain, so consistently that entire neighborhoods would smell of soap and steam on the same morning, every single week. If she was lucky, she had a twin tub, a machine with two separate compartments, one for washing and one for spinning, fed by hand from a tap because it had no plumbing connection of its own. If she was not lucky, and many were not, there was a mangle instead, a hand-crank device with two rollers that squeezed the water out of heavy wet clothes and bedsheets, worked by turning a handle over and over until her arm ached. Before either of these, there was often a copper, a large metal tub set into the kitchen, where water had to be boiled over a fire just to begin. There was no tumble dryer waiting to finish the job in 20 minutes. Everything had to be hung, outside if the weather allowed, strung across the yard or between houses on a shared line, and brought back in before rain ruined a full day's work. If the weather turned against her, the whole house filled with damp washing draped over chairs and clothes horses in front of the fire, and the smell of wet wool lingered for days. Nothing in that house was ever simply thrown away. Not a jumper with a hole in the elbow, not a pair of trousers worn through at the knee, not a shirt collar gone grey and frayed at the edge. Where a modern household reaches for a bin, this mother reached for a needle. They called it make do and mend, a phrase that started as wartime government advice and never really left British working-class homes for another 3 decades. Every house had a sewing machine, usually kept in a corner of the front room or bedroom, and it was almost never silent for long. Socks were darned using a wooden mushroom slipped inside to hold the shape while she wove new thread across the worn patch, over and under, until the holes simply disappeared. Trouser knees were patched with fabric cut from clothes too far gone to save otherwise. Shirt collars, worn thin from years of washing, were carefully unpicked, turned inside out and sewn back on so the good side faced outward again, buying another year of wear from a shirt that looked finished. Children's clothes moved down through the family without question, from the oldest to the youngest, altered by hand to fit a smaller frame each time they were passed along. A dress could become a skirt. A man's old shirt could become a child's nightgown. Almost nothing was considered truly finished until it had been unpicked, resized and reused at least once, sometimes several times over. This mattered because money genuinely could not stretch to constant replacement. But it was more than economics. There was real pride attached to this skill, the same quiet pride that lived in a properly stoned front step. A woman who could turn a collar so well nobody could tell, who could darn a sock so the mend was nearly invisible, was respected for it among other women on the street, the way a craftsman might be respected for fine work. Before breakfast could even be considered, there was the fire to deal with, and this was arguably the dirtiest job of her entire day. Most working-class homes in this period were heated by a coal fire, and the metal grate surrounding it turned dull and rust-prone if it was left untouched. So she blacked it, using a paste or polish applied by hand and worked into every groove and bar of the ironwork. She brought the grate back to a deep, even shine. Kneeling on the hearth in the cold before the fire had even been lit for the day, her hands turning black in the process no matter how carefully she worked. This had to happen constantly, not once a month, but several times a week in many households, because coal fires threw soot onto everything nearby, and a neglected grate looked instantly obvious to anyone who walked into the room. Alongside it came the brass, door handles, letterboxes and knockers polished with brasso until they caught the light, and windowsills that in some northern towns were treated with the same donkey stone used on the front step outside. Then came the food itself, and here too nothing was wasted. Sunday was the one day a joint of meat appeared on the table, often the only substantial meat the family would see all week, roasted and served with vegetables grown in a garden, or bought carefully from the greengrocer. But that joint had to last. Whatever remained on Monday was minced by hand, using a small grinder clamped to the edge of the kitchen table, turned by a crank until strips of leftover meat became something new entirely. most often a shepherd's pie or a simple mince dish that stretched one Sunday roast across 2 more meals. Birthdays brought jelly, made from scratch and set in a mold shaped like a rabbit or a rounded dome, the centerpiece of a table otherwise modest by today's standards. And every single meal, every day, was cooked entirely from raw ingredients, because convenience food as we understand it today barely existed yet, and what little did exist was far too expensive for a family living on a fixed weekly wage. And through all of this, somehow, there was still knitting. Not as a hobby in the way it might be understood today, something picked up occasionally for relaxation, but as another form of production, another way of clothing a family that could not afford to buy everything new. Jumpers, cardigans, socks, gloves, scarves, all of it made by hand, needles clicking away during any spare moment the day allowed, often while listening to the radio in the evening, the only entertainment most households had. A woman might be knitting a jumper for her husband while simultaneously keeping half an eye on a pot on the stove and calling instructions to a child doing homework at the table. This was not multitasking in the modern sense of juggling apps and notifications. It was survival multitasking, learned out of necessity, because there was genuinely no other way to get everything done that needed doing. And while she managed all of this indoors, her children were very often outside, entirely unsupervised in the way parents understand supervision today. Streets with light traffic meant children could play football, skip rope, or run games that spanned several houses without a parent standing over them. Mothers kept a general awareness of where their children were, often through the collective eyes of the whole street rather than any one individual watching closely. This was its own kind of trust, built the same way trust with the corner shop was built, through years of small, repeated interactions between neighbors who all knew each other's children by name. If a child fell or got into trouble 2 streets over, whichever mother was nearest simply dealt with it, patched a knee, gave a scolding, and sent the child home, no phone call required. It meant she could, for short stretches, actually get through her list of tasks without a small child physically underfoot. But it also meant something else, something people rarely acknowledge when they romanticize this era. She was never truly off-duty. Even with children playing outside, even with the appearance of a quiet afternoon, her attention remained partially fixed on the street, ready to react in an instant if something went wrong. School mornings brought their own fixed ritual, one that started the night before and never varied. Uniforms had to be ironed and laid out ready. Shoes polished to a shine using a tin of black or brown polish and a soft cloth, worked in small circles until the leather caught the light, because a child sent to school with scuffed shoes reflected directly on the mother who dressed him. Packed lunches, when they were needed, were built from whatever the week's budget allowed, usually bread and dripping or a thin slice of cheese, wrapped carefully in greaseproof paper because there was no other kind of wrapping readily available. Hair had to be neat, collars had to be straight, and every single morning this entire routine repeated itself for however many children the house held, often 3, 4, or 5, each one needing the same attention in the same short window of time before the walk to school began. There was no school run by car. Children walked, often in groups gathered from several houses along the street, with an older sibling or a nearby mother keeping a loose eye on the youngest ones as they went. And once they were gone, there was no pause. The moment the door closed behind the last child, she turned straight back to whatever the day's list demanded. Because a quiet house with no children in it was not free time. It was simply an opportunity to get through tasks that were nearly impossible to manage with them under her feet. Christmas, when it came, added an entire additional layer on top of everything else. Months of quiet preparation folded into an already full year. Puddings mixed and steamed as early as October or November. Small gifts knitted or sewn by hand across the autumn evenings. And a tin of savings, sometimes literally a tin with coins dropped into it every week, built up slowly enough that there would be something, however modest, under the tree in December. Now here is the part of this story that rarely gets told honestly. The part that sits underneath all the nostalgia like a weight nobody wants to look at directly. There was a competition running quietly through all of this, and it was not a friendly one. Local communities actually held contests with titles like Housewife of the Year, judging women on precisely the tasks described so far. Whose step was whitest? Whose grate shone brightest? Whose beds were made most precisely? Whose children looked cleanest and best behaved? This was not simply domestic life. It was domestic life turned into public evaluation, with real social consequences attached to losing. A woman who did not keep pace, whose step went unstoned for even a week or two, was not gently overlooked. She was talked about. The word used in parts of northern England was blunt and unkind, a term meaning someone lazy and unclean, applied to any woman who let the visible signs of her labor slip, regardless of what private circumstances might have caused it. Illness, exhaustion, a new baby keeping her awake for weeks, none of it mattered to the judgment of the street. The standard did not bend for exhaustion, so her entire identity, her entire sense of worth within the community, became tied to how well she performed inside a house that was never actually hers. The physical cost accumulated in ways nobody tracked. Knees worn raw from kneeling on stone steps for years on end. Hands cracked and reddened from cold water and strong soap, winter after winter. Backs strained from wringing wet sheets by hand, week after week for decades, with no physiotherapy, no complaint, and often no acknowledgement from anyone in the house that the labor was even happening. And perhaps the heaviest part of all of this is that she rarely, if ever, spoke about the weight of it. Not because she did not feel it, but because there was no language available to her for feeling it out loud. Exhaustion was simply Tuesday. Aching hands were simply Monday. There was no framework in working-class Britain of this period for treating a mother's physical and mental depletion as something worth naming. Doctors writing during the 1950s did begin to notice something troubling, but this understanding existed mostly in medical journals, not in the kitchens where the women themselves were living it. She woke before everyone else, and she was often still working after everyone else had gone to bed, finishing a hem by lamplight or checking tomorrow's shopping list against the coins left in a tin. There was no version of this life that included a day off. Sunday brought church, and the one proper meal of the week to prepare, not rest. There was no holiday because there was no one else positioned to take any of it over, even for a single day. So what happened to all of it? Where did this entire way of life actually go, and why did it disappear as completely as it did? Some of it left for good reason, and nobody sensible would argue otherwise. Washing machines with proper plumbing replaced the twin tub and the mangle through the 1960s and 70s, cutting an entire day of brutal manual labor down to less than an hour. Supermarkets, spreading rapidly across Britain from the 1960s onward, replaced the daily rounds of separate shops with a single weekly trip, saving hours that used to be spent walking between the butcher, the baker, and the greengrocer. Central heating replaced coal fires in most homes by the 1980s, and with it, the daily ritual of black leading a grate simply vanished, because there was no grate left to black. Donkey stone production itself ended for a very concrete reason. The last major manufacturer, a company operating in Ashton-under-Lyne since the 1890s, closed its doors in 1979. And once the supply dried up, the tradition dried up along with it within a single generation. Working-class women themselves largely welcomed these changes without hesitation, because underneath the discipline and the pride sat decades of exhausting, repetitive, physically punishing labor that most of them were relieved to finally set down. But something else left alongside the mangles and the coal fires. Something far harder to replace with a machine, and this is the part of the story that explains why so many people watching this today feel a genuine ache when they picture it, even though almost none of them would actually choose to go back. The tasks themselves were the excuse. The real thing they produced every single day was contact. Kneeling on a step next to the woman 2 doors down, trading gossip while you both worked. Walking to the same 3 shops every day and being greeted by name each time. Trusting a shopkeeper enough to owe him money, with nothing written down but his memory and yours. Letting your child play outside because you knew, without needing to check, that 6 other mothers were watching just as closely as you were. When the washing machine arrived, it did not just save her a day of labor, it also quietly removed the reason she used to stand outside talking to her neighbor while the copper boiled. When the supermarket arrived, it did not just save her time walking between shops. It also removed the small daily conversation with a butcher who had known her family for 15 years and always seemed to know exactly what kind of week she was having by the look on her face. There is another layer to this story that rarely makes it into nostalgic retellings, and it belongs earlier in the week, quietly running alongside everything already described. Late summer and early autumn brought preserving season, when whatever fruit could be grown, gathered, or bought cheaply before it spoiled, had to be turned into something that would last through winter. Blackberries picked from hedgerows by children sent out specifically for that purpose. Plums and apples from a garden, or traded with a neighbor who had a tree and no time to use all of it. All of it boiled down into jam, set in jars sterilized on the stove, sealed with wax paper and a rubber band, and lined up on a shelf that had to last the family through months, when fresh fruit was too expensive to consider. This was not a hobby either. It was insurance against a lean winter, done in whatever hours remained after everything else, often with children underfoot stirring a pot they were only just tall enough to reach. A single afternoon of preserving could produce a shelf of jam that stretched breakfast toast across an entire season, and a mother who failed to put anything by was once again quietly judged for it by the same unspoken standards that governed the step and the wash. And behind all of this sat a physical reality of the home itself that made every task harder than it needed to be. Many working-class houses through the 1950s, and in poorer areas well into the 1960s, had no bathroom at all. Bath night meant a tin tub brought in and filled by hand, kettle by kettle, in front of the fire, with the whole family sharing the same water, oldest or dirtiest last. The toilet itself was frequently outside, at the end of a small yard, regardless of weather, and keeping it clean was one more task added to a list that never actually ended. There was also a particular kind of quiet trust that existed in this world, one that seems almost unbelievable from today's vantage point. Mothers would leave prams with sleeping babies parked directly outside a shop while they stepped inside to buy bread or meat, in plain view of the street, but out of arm's reach, confident that nothing would happen in those few minutes, because the entire street operated on an unspoken agreement that everyone's children belonged, in some small way, to everyone. This trust extended in every direction. The rag-and-bone man, walking the streets with his horse and cart, calling out in a particular rising wail that every child in Britain of this era instantly recognized, took away what nobody wanted, and left behind small treasures in exchange. A donkey stone, a balloon for a child, a few coins if the scrap was valuable enough. He was not a stranger to be feared. He was a fixture, as reliable and familiar as the milkman leaving bottles on the step before dawn or the coalman delivering sacks. It is worth pausing here to say plainly what this adds up to, because taken individually, each task sounds almost manageable. A step scrubbed once a week, a day for washing, an evening of mending, but taken together, stacked one on top of another with no gap between them and no day fully set aside for rest, this was a working week that would exhaust any modern person within days. Sustained instead for decades, without a single sick day, without a partner sharing the load in any meaningful way, and without so much as a name for the exhaustion she was carrying. And she raised children through all of it. Fed them, clothed them in hand-knitted jumpers and carefully mended hand-me-downs, walked them to school, nursed them through measles and whooping cough without the antibiotics families rely on today, and somehow still found the energy, most evenings, to sit with them by the fire for a few minutes before the next day's list began all over again. Whatever else can be said about this era, the sheer physical and mental endurance required of a working-class British mother during these decades deserves to be understood clearly, not softened into a pleasant memory of headscarves and clean front steps. Because the clean front step was never really the point. It was the visible evidence of something much larger happening behind it. An entire domestic economy run single-handedly, with no wages, no holidays, no pension, and very often no thanks, by a woman who had been taught from childhood that this was simply what being a good wife and mother meant, and who passed that same lesson on to her own daughters without ever quite stopping to ask whether it was fair. And yet ask any of these women today, the ones still alive, to answer whether they regret the life they lived, and the response is rarely straightforward. Many will tell you about the ache in their knees without a flicker of bitterness. Because alongside the labor sat something modern life has struggled to replace, even with every convenience imaginable. A street where every door was, in practice, unlocked to a neighbor in need. A community that noticed immediately if something was wrong, because everyone was outside often enough to see it. A slower, harder, more physically demanding version of family life that nonetheless produced a closeness between neighbors that many people now spend money trying to recreate through community groups and organized events that never quite feel the same. This is the real complicated inheritance left behind by that generation of British working-class mothers. Not a simple story of suffering to be pitied, and not a simple story of a better, purer past to be mourned uncritically either. Something in between. Respect for the sheer scale of what these women carried, honesty about how unfair much of it actually was, and a genuine sense of loss for the parts of that world, the trust, the daily contact, the shared standards of an entire street that no washing machine or supermarket was ever going to be able to replace, no matter how much time it gave back. So when you picture her now, picture her properly. Not as a soft, sepia-toned figure in an apron smiling by a fire, the way she is so often flattened into in old photographs and advertisements from the period. Picture her on her knees on a cold stone step at 7 in the morning, hands raw, working a small block of stone back and forth with a precision that took years to perfect, thinking about the shopping list, the mending pile, and whatever was owed at the corner shop, all at the same time, while the street slowly woke up around her. Picture her wringing wet sheets by hand until her arms shook, blacking a grate with fingers that would stay faintly stained for hours afterward, and turning a Sunday joint into 3 more meals because nothing else was coming until payday. Picture her doing all of this while somehow still finding a moment, most days, to laugh with the woman next door, to send a child off with a wave and a warning to be home before dark, to sit down for 5 minutes with a cup of tea before starting again. That was the real shape of the life this video has tried to describe. Not a myth and not a monument, but a woman who worked harder every single day than most people today will ever be asked to, and who did it quietly, without complaint, because nobody had ever told her there was another way to live. She deserves to be remembered accurately, in full, the exhaustion alongside the pride, the unfairness alongside the closeness it created. If someone in your own family lived even a piece of this life, take a moment this week to actually ask her about it, properly, not as a passing comment, but as a real conversation. Ask her what Monday mornings were like. Ask her whether she remembers the sound of a mangle, or the smell of a donkey stone on wet pavement, or the particular ache in her hands every winter. Ask her who she used to talk to on the step, and whether she still speaks to any of them now. Because these details are not written down in most history books, not in any detail that matters. They exist almost entirely in memory, and memory, unlike a stone step, does not leave a worn groove behind for someone to find 50 years later. It simply goes quiet when the person carrying it goes quiet, and once that happens, it does not come back. Tell her story in the comments below, because these stories disappear the moment nobody is left to tell them. Give this video a like if it meant something to you. Share it with someone who would recognize every word of it, and subscribe to the channel, because this is exactly the kind of real, disappearing British history we bring back every single week.